Return to learning during COVID-19 case studies is our webcast for today. My name is Margie Bhatt, and I will be your facilitator today. I see many of us have joined in. Thank you. If you want to take a moment to add your name to the chat and tell us your organization, where you're located, and why you've joined us today. Thanks. In addition to being your facilitator today, I'm the lead for the Education in Crisis and Conflict Network, or ECCN, as it may be known to many of you, and an associate director of evidence and learning for the USAID's Leading Through Learning Global Platform. If you're not already a member, please join us by going to the link that we'll share in the chat. This webinar is the second in a series of activities and engagement under this global platform. If you missed the first webinar on monitoring return to learning, please follow the link in the chat and view the recording. So for today's webinar, the goal is for education practitioners who have an increased awareness and appreciation for the contextual considerations that shape how, why, and when return to learning strategies are effective. To this end, we will compare and contrast experiences of return to learning from Georgia and Lebanon. You'll also hear about the research that expanded beyond these two countries to Colombia, Nigeria, and Zambia. We will identify strategies and principles for return to learning that cut across different countries and cultural contexts, and forecast what return to learning challenges may emerge in the months and years ahead that require a contextualized lens. Today, you'll hear an overview of the case studies from Georgia and Lebanon. We'll have time for you to ask questions, and then we'll have some final evaluation and closing remarks. Today, we're really lucky to be joined by Gwen Heener, who was the team lead on developing these case studies, Dr. Basil Akar, who is the lead researcher from Lebanon, Dr. Nadia Anguladze, who is the lead researcher from Georgia, and Medea Kakachia, USAID's Education and Social Project Management Specialist. So let's get started with this great set of individuals and experts who are here to talk to us. Gwen, I'll pass the mic to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Margie, and thank you everyone for being here today. Before I get started, I do need to acknowledge the team that was involved in this. It was a big collaborative effort and was not possible without everyone. So I have to acknowledge first Dr. Jennifer Fleming and Julie Chinnery, who were co-researchers with me leading the 5-country research. And also, of course, Dr. Basil Akar and Dr. Nadia Anguladze, who you'll hear from today on the Lebanon and Georgia case studies. But also we have Benny Mwanga, who led the Zambia research. We have Ana Maria Restrepo Sayens, who led the Colombia research, and Foluke Fadare and Gideon Olanrewaju, who led the Nigeria research. Also, Nina Weisenhorn was our activity manager at USAID, and all the USAID missions in these countries and all of the stakeholders who spoke to us were very helpful in this research. So thank you everyone for this great collaborative effort. Next slide. So I'll just provide a really quick overview of the case studies before passing it along to the local consultants who did the work in Georgia and Lebanon. Next slide. So as you know, we did the work in 5 countries, and there were 2 purposes for this research. One was to simply document the return to learning process that was ongoing as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. And we followed in this inquiry the return to learning framework that you might be familiar with given the webcast we had a couple weeks ago on this. But the image there to the right shows the priority areas around which the return to learning was, supposed to be followed. And in the middle is equity and inclusion. And so what we did was we really looked at the return to learning process in each of these contexts along those priority areas. What we also wanted to do was not just document the process and what happened, but also capture the perspectives on how this process went. And this was through education, stakeholder interviews, and document review as well. And one thing that really stood out about this research was that we took a strengths-based approach. By that, I mean, we were not simply documenting what were some of the challenges that were ongoing, but really digging deep into some of the assets that were leveraged in the return to learning process by education actors, and also how were they adapting and innovating given the challenges that they were facing. Next slide. So the method, as we mentioned already, we had local consultants in each of the countries who were leading the research really doing all of the interviews and really guiding the way forward on what we should be digging into. And we also did a multi-wave qualitative methodology. What that means is that we had a discrete period of research, maybe 4 to 6 weeks. We would go do the interviews, and then we would all as a team meet together, all the local consultants, the international team, USAID, and discuss what we found and what lines of inquiry we should pursue further going forward, because it's a very big topic, of course. In some areas deserved more attention and others could be honed in on a lot more. What we were really looking at was only the first 14 months of the pandemic. So the research took place between December 2020 and April 2021. So of course we were looking back toward the beginning of the pandemic and then stopping at the first 14 months to really look at what was happening during that time. And in the end, what resulted was 5 case study reports and 1 synthesis report, and you can go to the registration link page and those are published there. And we encourage you to read those because there's lots of rich details, and today is really just a taste of what is in there. Next slide. So just a quick snapshot of the timeline of school closures and reopenings that was happening across the context. And this is really to show you the diversity in approaches that we were looking at. So you can see in some cases, schools were closed for a very long time. Others opened quite quickly, only to close again. Some had partial reopenings. So a lot of diversity in the types of return to learning that we saw across these case studies. Next slide. So despite the variety, there were some common pathways of response to return to learning. So we saw across the case studies, initially there was the desire to minimize exposure and minimize impact with, of course, school closure that we're all familiar with. Then there was generally a national coalition mobilization and initial distance learning responses. And as the pandemic continued, those distance learning responses were further refined, given that it didn't seem as though the pandemic was ending as soon as many had hoped. Next slide. So what we also saw as the pandemic continued was the drafting of national and regional or state level plans for the continuity of learning. And within that were a number of plans around how to return to learning safely given COVID-19, so health and safety protocols, for example. Next slide. And then finally, we saw the transition back to in-person learning. And this took a variety of approaches. There was different modes of instruction and scheduling, for example, blended learning or alternating schedules. There were also different models of return around teaching and learning, accelerated programs, automatic advancement, and so on. Next slide. So what we really want to focus in on today, and what is really wonderful about having our speakers here today, are what we called pockets of promise. So I mentioned earlier, we were taking a strengths-based approach in this research. And again, what that means is we wanted to identify when education actors were leveraging the expertise, resources, and mechanisms available to them and adapting the responses to changing contexts and needs. And so when we did these interviews, we were really digging into, okay, what was a strategy that was really effective, and how was it that this crisis had you needing to work in this way? And what have we learned from that? And so we saw a number of pockets of promise, and today we'll just share a couple. Again, the case studies are rich with these, but we saw them at the national level, which included mobilization of connections and relationships, leveraging decentralized structures, national recognition for school level leadership, and tapping into existing resilience capacities, especially in contexts that had previous crises. And then also at the subnational level, so many examples of civil society, teacher, and parent innovations to fill gaps. So again, we're going to touch on a couple of those today with our presentations. We'll have a rich discussion with our speakers and also with Medea Kakachia, who's here from USAID Georgia, and then we can dig in deeper into those. And before I introduce Dr. Natia Anguladze, I want to point out that as Dr. Natia Anguladze and Dr. Basil Akar will be presenting, Darren Cambridge will be putting some questions to you all, the audience, in the chat in all caps. And those are meant for you to respond to as practitioners in your own context, because we would also like you all to learn from each other as we share our own findings. So with that, Dr. Natia Anguladze, welcome and thank you for presenting today.
Thank you, Gwen. Can you hear me well?
Great.
Yeah, thanks. So before moving to my presentation topic, I would like to give you a very brief overview of the schooling modalities throughout the pandemic. So in March, all schools moved to online distance learning and had to stay online throughout the semester. Online distance learning, like in many countries, was concerned with major challenges with access to into the internet and digital devices at home, especially for rural areas with limited or in some cases with no internet connection in some areas. So in the next academic year, the government decided to differentiate schooling modalities according to location and also the risk of exposure. So schools in 8 large cities were to stay online on online distance learning during the first semester. And then when they reopened in February, parents could choose between online and in-person learning. But in rural areas and small towns, a school would close only if a COVID case was reported. There were many challenges in the process, both with online learning as well as ensuring safety for children and staff when schools opened. And this study was a fascinating opportunity to investigate the ways in which the school communities and institutions, both donor agencies as well as the government agencies, dealt with these challenges. But in this presentation, I would like to focus on just one aspect, and it is concerned with informal teacher professional support channels and their role in guiding teacher communities in these challenging times. Next slide, please. So moving online required major methodological adaptations, but besides that, many teachers in Georgia did not have the very basic skills, basic ICT skills to work with online platforms. So the government agencies started to develop video materials, webinars on different topics on online teaching and learning, mobilized a network of ICT coaches to help schools move teaching and learning online, but they were not able to keep up with the demand. So teachers stepped in to help each other, and some teachers went beyond their immediate school community and used social media, Facebook and YouTube, to reach out to teachers all over the country. Teachers have been active on Facebook for over a decade, but the activity was concentrated around discussing policy issues, basically complaining about different regulations, and also looking for information on sharing information on different regulations, especially concerning with teacher certification or trainings. These kinds of Facebook groups, the ones that were concentrated on these issues, remained stable over the pandemic, but the ones focused on the pedagogical solutions and ideas grew and new ones emerged. They started with sharing small video tutorials on Microsoft Teams. This was the main online platform that most schools used. And using Microsoft Teams was the #1 and most immediate challenge for most teachers. And then these groups moved to developing and sharing teaching resources. For example, presentation slides, quizzes, and tests, the resources that teachers need in dealing with everyday tasks of lesson planning and assignments. So, and most interesting development was that other members of these groups also started to develop and share their own resources. This is interesting and impressive because, as our study participants reported, Georgian teachers would normally shy away from sharing their work with their colleagues, even within one school. Next slide, please. So to give you a perspective on how popular these groups were, one of such groups grew from 300 members to 30,000 members during the first 2 semesters of the pandemic, and now it has reached 41,000 members. This is an impressive membership, considering that there are only 60,000 teachers in the country. And an administrator of one such group, a young primary school teacher, could arguably accomplish more than a government agency with over 150 full-time staff members. So why is this finding important to consider? Teacher professional support in Georgia has been centralized and run by a single government agency for over a decade. And this is probably true for many countries, especially in the region. And this agency is responsible for identifying what teachers need to learn and even conducting trainings for teachers. But the pandemic showed that there are maybe better alternatives policymakers should consider. There are teachers who can offer the kind of support that is relevant to the immediate needs of their colleagues, and they can be more successful in building truly functioning communities of practice, which the existing centralized policies have failed to accomplish. Of course, the question now is whether these kinds of collaborative channels will remain relevant when the urgency of the pandemic fades away. But perhaps a more important question is how to capitalize on these emerging teacher collaborative capacities. I hope our findings resonate with some of your observations about teacher behavior throughout the pandemic, and you can share your thoughts and ideas with us. Thank you. Over to you, Basar.
Thank you, Natia, and I'll go ahead and introduce Dr. Basil Akkar, who will present our Lebanon case study.
Thank you, Gwen. Hi, everyone. So in Lebanon, the global pandemic, well, first of all, yes, I do want to recognize, I want to acknowledge my research partner, Julie Chinnery, for her leadership and diligence in carrying out the country case study for Lebanon. So thank you very much, Julie. Unfortunately, she's not present with us today. So the global pandemic had joined a number of crises in Lebanon when the crisis started. And so here we have some long-running stressors. So there's obviously a history of corruption and institutionalized corruption. We have a history of political tensions and armed conflicts. And Lebanon was also hosting the largest population of refugees per capita in the world, mostly from the war in Syria. Then October 2019, about 4 months or 3 months before actual school closures, the people in Lebanon initiated uprisings against the corrupt government. So in November and in October and November, we had about 6 weeks of interrupted schooling, mostly because of roadblocks and closures. Then the 1st of March 2020, like in Georgia, schools officially closed. And we then this was also at the same time as an economic collapse and a collapse of the banking sector. So the Lebanese currency crashed, losing more than 90% of its value. And then August 4 that year, there was an explosion at the Beirut port, displacing 300,000 Lebanese people and just not completely destroying, but having some destruction in about 200 schools in the area. So here we have compounded crises that have already pushed an education system, whether from governance to the classrooms, further into a state of fragility and fatigue. Now, in this study, we were also looking at degrees of resilience. So the strategies that the stakeholders, like parents and children and teachers, and those at the Ministry of Education and donor agencies were taking and analyzing those strategies as, okay, so this was an indicator that shows support to resilience or indicator of resilience. And then here are some expressions of weak resilience. So I'm not gonna be able to go through all of them that are in the report, but I've selected some of my favorites and I'll quickly just highlight some of them. One of them is that teachers' agentic actions to transform their practice. So some of the initial responses, particularly from the ministry, were, let's say, policies on how to govern online learning and access to Microsoft Teams. But children did not have access to electricity, or not all children had access to electricity, hardware like a tablet or even a phone, and internet. And so teachers had to find new platforms or different platforms that use less mobile data, like WhatsApp or maybe even Zoom, and find ways to communicate with parents. We saw a lot of individual one-on-one kind of support, and especially working within the house. So they were teaching from home, where they were managing their own families, own children. And so we saw a lot of different strategies being adopted by teachers, and these came from their own initiatives. We also saw a lot of, or let's say some of the initial responses came from the non-formal sector and international agencies, who, from the Syrian refugee education crisis, they had developed resources during that period, and they had mobilized these resources to respond quickly by to carry out studies, situation analyses, and then figure out ways to respond quickly to particularly the non-formal education programs, to make sure that those were still running. Then certain expressions of weak resilience that I will just highlight quickly, and this mostly came from the interviews with those at the government sector, were descriptions of patchwork, putting out fires. So rather than addressing the more, addressing issues that would support more sustainable change. The ministry's responses were also, they also overlooked certain routes to issues. So for example, with a teacher workforce of 40,000 teachers, more than half are on contract or part-time. And this was a route to, or this was a cause of maybe some of the teacher strikes that happened during school closures, and degrees of burnout among the teachers. So when thinking about the pockets of promise, we, here I highlight, just for this presentation, I'll highlight about three. And one of them is teacher agency. And just for us to think about, you know, what kind of support would we need to focus on strengthening these teacher networks, or discovering and learning more about the initiatives that teachers took to connect with parents, to connect with the children, that can help other teachers and principals capitalize on these agentic actions. We also saw some growing and promising intentions across some of the ministries, agencies, which before were some of the roots to or causes of the limitations of accessing education. And then we also saw that there was potential to further support how the government drafts policy frameworks or response strategies or education sector development plans. Because, and this came from the interviews with the donor agency representatives and also with the ministry, that many of these strategies and documents emerged as mostly calling for resources rather than seeing what is available in Lebanon and using those resources. So one of the pockets of promise in this area is supporting the ministry agencies and how to develop strategy response plans. And the report is filled with so much more interesting findings and pockets of promise. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Basil, and thank you, Natia. And just like Basil said, it was tough to figure out what to condense into a short presentation, but we do really encourage you all to check out the reports. And now what we're going to do is turn to question and answer period. And thanks to you all who registered and put in some of your own comments and questions for the presenters, we've compiled a couple questions to discuss. As we're doing this, please feel free to drop in any additional questions you might have into the chat. We'll do our best to get to them as we go through. So if I could invite Dr. Medea Kakachia also to come on from USAID Georgia, who will be engaged in the discussion, and Natia and Basil, you can put on your cameras and we can just talk. So the first discussion question, and again, this is based on what we saw in the comments from those who registered. We saw a lot of comments asking simply what works in the return to learning. And I think what we learned from the case study research is that it's so context specific that we can't quite answer this question. We can say what works universally though, is that successfully leveraging the assets available to an education system and innovating new ones works in its own contextually specific ways. And so the case studies provide these pockets of promise that have some of these examples of what works and that may be applicable to your own contexts for those of you looking in. So at this point, I'd like to invite the discussants to reflect more on these pockets of promise in their context. And I'd like to start with the example shared by Natia on teacher groups and invite Dr. Medea Kakachia to reflect on what some of those implications of the finding are for USAID Georgia in thinking about the support to return to learning. And then I'll just let everyone freely discuss from there. Thank you. Medea, are you here? There you
Yeah,
are.
I'm here. I thought Natia was gonna go first, but what I want to say, first of all, thank you for this opportunity of being part of the study and for the close collaboration with USAID's mission. I want to echo what Natia said about the pockets of promise regarding how teachers initiated and Facebook groups, and I want to add a couple of additional support how this learning helped us to improve our programming and respond to this and build on this initiative. We supported Facebook groups of teachers that we saw were increasing, that their numbers were increasing. We supported creating them thematic Facebook groups. We supported them connecting with the Facebook of our program, reposting their posts. We also connected them with the Facebook of the mission and reposted their posts. This helped us to increase our own followers, by the way. We helped to improve the ICT skills of teachers by training them through a learning management system, which is the teacher training system that we are creating through our programming. Yeah, and then last but not least is that we expedited our work on developing more learning resources for teachers, those who could be downloaded to Facebook and to their phones even. I think one thing why the Facebook groups were successful is because even though many teachers didn't have access to computers, but others had their phones, so we created learning resources that were compatible with both devices, and they had great opportunity to use resources that we have created through the program.
Can I also add to Medea's point? So it's not only about Facebook and supporting Facebook groups, but also the work that USAID has done over the years in terms of, helping teachers develop their skills, and feeling some kind of confidence to start sharing with others, right? So this happens through, teacher associations that USAID have supported over the years, or even the projects on teaching methodology, bringing new teaching methodology into schools, so that gradually teachers build their capacity and feel the confidence. And in time, you see throughout these projects, G-Pride, you see, or other projects that USAID has been implementing over the years, you see that leaders, teachers who, you know, kind of feel the confidence and the competence to share with others stand out, and you see them in different platforms, not only Facebook, but also, you know, kind of becoming leaders of the profession. And this is the main point, I think, if we want to support this informal channels of collaboration.
We also initiated the civic education program, which one of the main components of which would be digitalization and digital skills of teachers in basic education, which also is very important.
Thanks, Nadia. Thanks, Medea. Basil, I know that there were some other pockets of promise you wanted to elaborate on. Would you like to go ahead?
Yes, thank you. I think some of the pockets of promise that I wanted to talk a little more about were, well, I highlighted some already about the NFE sector and international agencies that, you know, they had developed these resources and networks and capacities, and they were able to mobilize them during another crisis. I also think that some of the good practices or promising practices that did come out were the teachers' new relationships with the children and with the parents. The parents across education, research, and emergency, at least in Lebanon, seem to be the least, or seem to be the stakeholders that are least reached out to and least involved and least empowered. And we were able to gather some evidence of how teachers had created new relationships with parents, new working relationships with them, even though some were very difficult and challenging, but they did reveal a potential, at least. I also want to respond quickly to one of the comments from Joshua Joza about lessons for what works and the return learning for learners with disabilities. Thank you, Joshua. Unfortunately, and I think we might talk about this soon, that those with children with special educational needs and disabilities were probably among the most marginalized during school closures. Because of their the lack of support that they were receiving from home during online learning. And of course, parents may have found that, you know, that it was not important for them at the moment, especially parents from low-income families. Thank
you.
Medea, please go ahead. Thanks, Basil.
In response to Joshua's question, also I wanted to add that we started creating learning resources for students that have universal design, and this would be books and videos with the universal design in mind. We understand it's not enough, but we are trying to advance more in terms of supporting students who are coming back who have learning disabilities.
Nadia, go ahead.
Also, during the pandemic, when everything was closed, the ministry made an exception for the special needs students. Schools had to open these, we call it resource rooms. These are rooms specifically for students with special needs, and parents could take the children, I mean, twice a week to school and have kind of regular interaction with each other. So this was the kind of exception that was made for students with special needs during the pandemic. But also the ministry worked with set up the networks of consultants on for special needs students, and they worked with parents, but also with educators in schools. This is something that the government has done. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. And I think I can comment just more generally on the broader point of inclusion and equity that we found across the case studies. And this is spoken to quite a lot in our synthesis report, where we really delve into the issues of the resilience of education systems and how, in particular, we might see examples of building back better, for example, which includes attention to marginalized learners. And I think one of the major findings is that, especially in contexts that have previous crisis and conflict situations, it's very hard to get back to normal, and we see more of a pathway of building back rather than everything happening at once at one time. And so, I think it's something that is absolutely needing more attention. And as Basil said, it was really difficult to pull out some of these pockets of promise in some of the cases where there were existing crises ongoing. So thank you for that. I think we can move on to the next discussion question. And this, it's all related, and we already touched on this a little bit, but I want the speakers to elaborate a bit more on what are some areas for improvement. Again, we saw that the questions across the audience about what works, but we also see what are some of the challenges. And as I was just mentioning, a finding across case studies is that pre-crisis resilience capacities were significantly impacted on the resilience trajectories that we saw in the return to learning during COVID. So we saw that where there were existing assets to build upon, there was perhaps a better response going forward. But where there were limited assets to begin with, it was harder to build back. So I'd like the speakers to comment a bit more on how some of the existing challenges in their own contexts might have been effectively considered or not in the response to the return to learning.
Thank you, Gwen. If I could start, just want to highlight one idea, is that sometimes it wasn't just a limited resource, but some of the ongoing stressors, such as, let's say, the combination of governance issues, and we name it corruption, along with political tensions, that those had continued throughout the development of responses to or strategies to return children to learning. And so, and it's really, really important to also to basically keep in mind that, and I don't shy away from describing it as authoritarian-like. So in such governance systems, the teachers and the children and the parents are viewed largely as recipients, and rather than collaborators or individuals with agency. And so most of the responses that were developed from the top were developed as respond very, very short-sighted, and very, very dependent on external support. Thank you.
Go ahead, Natia.
So, of course, with many countries, digital divide was one of them, probably the biggest issue for ensuring access to schooling. And the country has not managed to mobilize the resources to deal with the internet connection issues with schools, or come up with an optimized model for remote schools or small schools. So online distance learning is not a good option even when now the pandemic rates are very high. And also the parents across the country are against online distance learning, and they often use argument against online learning the methodological limitations in online distance learning, right? And this is something that the government has missed throughout the first and a half, 1.5 year of the pandemic. That's kind of helping teachers to prioritize objectives and come up with teaching methods that are more relevant for the online format. And this is kind of linked to the historical context. I mean, we have invested in ICT in education. To give you an example, like every first grader in public schools receives free computer device when they enter school. So, but despite that investment, there has been not much done in terms of teaching, developing teaching resources in Georgian. So we have basically given out the computers without any content, and teachers have limited using ICT, just asking students to prepare copy and paste content from internet into presentation slides. So, and this issue of this methodological issue has not been, addressed even during the pandemic. Kind of ministry got busy with dealing with technical issues of, connecting teachers through students through Microsoft Office, but there was very little guidance from the ministry in terms of how am I supposed to teach online? How am I supposed to squeeze my lessons into 20 and 30-minute online classes? So this is something that we have not managed to deal with, but the ministry has now started building an LMS system to share resources, to develop online teaching and learning resources for blended learning, and hopefully we will be, better prepared for the next time.
Thanks, Natia. Go ahead, Medea.
I want to explain that for years in Georgia, we are working to improve the student-centered learning, student-centered instruction in classrooms. You have to remember Georgia is a post-Soviet country with the tradition of top-down, teacher-led classes, and we are changing that modality to critical thinking, developing instructions. So on top of that, the COVID presented a new challenge of changing the modalities from classroom into online and from online back into classroom. So our immediate task, which came out of this study, was also how to help not just some teachers, but the critical mass of teachers to be flexible, to have skills of transition, easily transitioning from online to in-person and vice versa. So to this end, we started helping teachers to develop, for instance, low-cost resources that they can develop themselves with little help from the school administration and use them in both electronic and in-person modalities. We have started providing learning resources for students as well as teaching resources for teachers. And then what is important, we are now starting very interesting assessment. We want to assess to introduce what is called the time on task survey, when we want to assess what has happened during these online studies. How has time on task decreased in classrooms, by how much and why? And then the results of the study will be presented to the ministry, and this will help the ministry to introduce maybe the policies, but also will show the teachers how they can adjust their online or going back to in-person classes so that they could increase their own effectiveness in the classroom and allocate more time to the task.
Thank you both. I want to get to one question. We're almost done with the discussion, but one question posed by Sonia Gomez. Did you find any attention to assessing children's learning needs as they return to schools, having missed out, and they may have returned with mixed learning needs? And I'll just comment quickly on an example in the Columbia case study, which you can find in the document. One of the major findings of that case was that we looked at a very decentralized education system where in the secretarias, the areas in which the education, the schools were managed, had different approaches that they were empowered to take. And what we found was that in some of them, they, before even the national sort of guidance was released, were assessing the needs of their learners to see what it was that was most urgent for them to meet their needs at that point. And in some of them, it actually turned out that there was so much missed learning as a result of the limited online accessibility that they were really urging students to get back to school urgently. In other examples of other secretarias, there was less capacity to do that level of assessment. And so we just saw quite a mixed result in terms of the way that the return to learning process was implemented. So some good examples in the Columbia case study there. I know we only have 1 minute, but I also want to do a quick nod to Caleb Beauvair's question about pockets of promise and responses that effectively address some of the underlying and structural challenges that existed pre-pandemic. And I think if we can go to the next slide, this is touching a bit on our third discussion question. And we already mentioned this as it related to disability, but I wanted to know what the pandemic taught the speakers about marginalization in their own contexts, and how do you address students who fall through the cracks both before the pandemic and those for whom it was exacerbated as a result of this. So we just have a couple minutes. So Natia, Medea, or Basil, if you want to come in, please go ahead. Go ahead, Natia.
So in Georgia, as in other countries in the region, we do not have policies and programs in place to address the needs of students who fall behind. And this systemic problem has traditionally affected marginalized students, because these are the ones that usually, have trouble in catching up when they fall behind. So a student from poor families, ethnic minority language schools, also students with disabilities. So the discussion in our interviews was concentrated around the importance of parental engagement with an implicit or explicit attribution of the problem of falling behind, or, with the role of parents. And usually, everybody, policymakers and teachers and school principals, usually point towards the parents. So the problem lies with the parents, and nobody talks about the things that schools and the education system to get, programs, central level programs should do to address the needs of these students. So, and hopefully there's an opportunity as well to use this pandemic and the discussion that has been raised by NGOs and media about the access or digital divide and learning loss, to push forward the discussion on equity and the challenges that students in rural areas or ethnic minority schools face, and also to push forward the need for some systems at school level to support these kind of students, identify their needs and address them, and help the schools develop the capacity to deal with these kinds of challenges. Thank you.
Can I jump in? Hello?
Yes, you can. Gwen, you're muted.
Oh, okay. So just I think I've spoken enough about at the top level, even though I could speak a little bit more about how the approaches that government agencies take do sustain marginalization. I would also want to mention that from the interviews with teachers, we're seeing more and more evidence of children missing practically 2 years of learning in Lebanon. So since the uprisings in October, and then the pandemic, so the grade 3 students have missed grades 1 and 2. And there is a great deal of concern over how we can get these children, and some will say back to basics, and meaning the understanding the conceptual knowledge of the different disciplines. Few organizations, international organizations out there that have been working on kind of remedial support over the summer. Non-formal education programs have been doing a fantastic job, I think. But yes, this is one of the big issues in what's been marginalizing the children even more. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil, and thank you, everyone. And I'll pass it over to Margie.
Thanks, Gwen. Thank you, everybody. I see lots of really great questions in the chat here. So thank you for your engagement. Just quickly want to say thank you, Dr. Gwen Hainer, Dr. Natia Anguladze, Dr. Basil Akar, and Dr. Medea Kakatia. Today we learned ways education actors leverage expertise, resources, and mechanisms to adapt and respond to the changing context and needs. The research presented today showed pockets of promise. Among many things, we learned about the evidence that called for more flexible teacher professional development. We also learned that strengthening networks at the school level can be incredibly effective. And speaking of networks, the platform that brought you this webcast today, the Leading Through Learning Global platform, is also made up of networks. And we would love to hear from you. Thank you for sharing all of your thoughts and ideas in the chat. But if you could just take a moment to fill out a very short evaluation form for us, it'll really help us guide what we present to you next. We want to hear what you're interested in, and we want to also share any pockets of promise or resources that you have with the wider network. So as we are all taking giant steps to return to learning in our respective contexts, we will play the song Giant Steps by John Coltrane as you fill out this evaluation form. And then in just 2-3 minutes, we'll give you time to fill out the form, but then stay tuned as I'll share some upcoming exciting opportunities that are coming through Leading Through Learning Global platform. So please click on the link to the evaluation form. And Anita, if you could play some music for us, we'll be back in a couple of minutes. Thanks, everybody. There we go. Oh, I don't think we can hear the music, Anita. It's very faint. Okay, thank you so much for opening up that evaluation form and taking the time to fill it out for us. The evaluation form will still be available following the webinar, so please go ahead and add your thoughtful ideas there. I just want to say that overall, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the need to strengthen education systems globally so they are better equipped to address and cope with ever-increasing shocks and stressors. We've seen some of that, the ways in which we've done that in the case studies presented today. I encourage you to download the report and learn the details of the evidence that was generated from both Georgia and Lebanon, but as well as Colombia, Nigeria, and Zambia. The synthesis report also offers summative understanding of what was learned across these 5 case studies, including how we can apply a resilience lens to responding to COVID-19 so that we are better prepared for future shocks. We know that there are lots of other pockets of promise out there. How have you adapted, leveraged resources and expertise to meet the needs of education provision during COVID-19? Please reach out to us if you want to share your pockets of promise. We can share it with our membership across Leading Through Learning. We also welcome a blog post where you describe your work and share the evidence of the pockets of promise, and we'll be glad to share it further through our various communications channels. As the pandemic continues, the community is learning, and we see the value in documenting this learning and sharing it widely so others can benefit. Reach out to us at USAID@edc.org and let us know about your work and how you'd like it featured. This webinar was a second in a series of webinars related to COVID-19. Join us next time when we discuss distance learning. We will meet again on Tuesday, November 30th, 2021, from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Check the ECCN events page for registration details coming soon. Another opportunity is an upcoming training on risk assessment in schools. Join experts from CDC's COVID-19 International Task Force Mitigation Team for virtual training on COVID-19 mitigation measures and risk assessment in schools. This training will take place on November 4th, 2021 from 8 to 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and will be in French. You can find the registration link in the chat. Thank you to our presenters, panelists, and experts. We learned a lot from you today, and thank you to our participants for joining and sharing your work with us. We hope to see you next time. Thanks, everybody. Take care.